the fact is the ballgame has changed. Now nobody seems to care whether the president gets elected with the most votes. In fact, it's almost a virtue that they not be.
Welcome to Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World, a podcast focused on reimagining how we define success. Co-hosted by myself, Monty Bernard, and CEO of Expensify, David Barrett. Today on the podcast, we have John Koza, co-founder of National Popular Votes, an organization looking to roll back the winner-takes-all approach of the Electoral College in favor of a system that focuses on the states granting their Electoral College votes to the candidate that wins the, you guessed it, National Popular Vote. We very publicly endorsed Biden in this last election and wanted to talk to someone on the front lines of our democracy. How did you think the conversation went, David?
Well, yeah, I think it was incredible seeing an organization, candidly, just as small as National Popular Vote, accomplish such enormous change. I think it's super inspirational for anyone who's trying to make the world a better place to realize you don't need $1 billion. You don't need a huge organization. It's like 6 part-time people are changing the most important part of the presidential election. And that's an incredible and inspirational tale.
It's a fantastic story. Stick around for it. From National Popular Vote, today we have John Koza. He is the chair of National Popular Vote and a member of the board of directors, as well as lead author of the book, Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by National Popular Vote. He's also the originator of the National Popular Vote legislation. On top of that, he's also a board game inventor, a former professor of genetic algorithms and genetic programming at Stanford University. Quite the resume. John, thanks so much for joining us today. How's your day going so far?
Good, and thank you very much for having me.
Of course, our pleasure, our pleasure. Want to dive right into it and talk about our recent election back in November. A lot to unpack there still, even now. David, I'll let you get into it.
Yeah, so I was so excited to talk with you because for years, if anyone asked me if I could be king for a day, what would I do? I would say I would enact the National Popular Vote. I think the way I view it is the highest ROI change that we could possibly make. Because if you could improve, the decision-making capability of the United States by 1%, whatever that even really means, I think that has a bigger impact on basically every global issue than any single policy you could do. So I'm a huge fan. I've been a fan for a long time. And I would just love to hear a bit more about, when we talked a couple of years back, you talked about the organization as a small but incredibly effective organization. And for me, that was super inspirational that such a group of people could actually enact such important change. And so I'd kind of love to hear, an overview right now of like what is the organization like and how do you operate on a daily basis?
Well, our goal is to have the president elected by a popular vote of the people in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And it turns out the Constitution gives the state legislatures the power to decide how the president is elected. So what our organization does is we go out and talk to the state legislators to try to get them to pass our legislation. There's 7,400 of them in the country. So our organization's main audience is the 7,400 state legislators. But of course, all the other people in state government or the Congress, the media, professors, and civic groups and so forth. But the ultimate audience is these 7,400 state legislators. And we're lobbyists. We go out and talk to them one by one. I can't tell you exactly how many we've talked to over the years, but it's probably about 4,000. We've had about 1,000 meetings this year, many on Zoom. They used to be more in person, but that is what we do.
Yeah, I want to get back to the kind of what changes have been triggered by COVID, because that's always the topic du jour, but maybe kind of just stepping back a bit. So can you just briefly for, the readers or the listeners that don't already know, kind of explain the mechanics of how the interstate compact works?
Well, it's a piece of state legislation, and it says, for example, like Colorado was one of the states that passed it recently. It says Colorado will award its 9 electoral votes to the presidential candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. But it doesn't go into effect until states having a majority of the electoral votes pass the very same law. And at that point, since a majority of the Electoral College would have passed this law, there would then be a majority of the Electoral College that would be given to the candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states. So we create a nationwide election for president by passing state laws, and the interstate compact is just a fancy way of saying that the legislation takes effect at a certain point. In our case, when states having 270 of the 538 electoral votes pass the very same law.
Yeah, it reminds me of there's a website called Kickstarter, which is all about basically raising funds for nonprofits. And it's sort of you contribute funds, but no one actually pays anything until the campaign is earned enough to basically get across a certain threshold. So there's no risk to participate because either nothing happens or you get what you want, but you never actually end up paying for something that you didn't want. And I think this is a great example of like this kind of Kickstarter effect on a much more important stage.
Well, that is a good analogy. And of course, no one state would want to give its electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote unless it knew that enough other states were doing it that it would actually produce a nationwide election of the president.
Absolutely. And so I know that this is a very complicated topic, but I'd be curious for just what would you say is the most significant and most persistent kind of like piece of opposition that you get? What's like the biggest criticism that you get, and what's your sort of, how do you rebut it?
Well, the biggest single opposition is inertia.
Yeah. Okay.
And inertia comes from several sources. One is, particularly when we were getting started, nobody believed that it could be accomplished. So it was viewed as a pie in the sky issue that really wasn't worth legislators spending any time on. And that still persists as a major issue because we've got 16 states now that have enacted this with 196 electoral votes. So we're 74 short of the 270. But still, when you go to any one legislature, obviously has less than 74 electoral votes, they don't quite see, some of them won't quite see the urgency of doing anything. And legislators are very busy. They deal with thousands of different proposals in the course of a year. And if something doesn't seem likely to happen, it's not very attractive.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of the early days of a startup as well, where you're just basically out there with an idea, a laptop, and basically everyone thinks it's like, well, you're very cute. That's a great idea, but that will never, ever happen. And so I'd be curious, like, when you think back to the earliest days, how did that like first meeting go where someone's just like, what are you talking about? This is wild.
As a matter of fact, the very first legislative chamber that passed it was sort of spontaneous. The Colorado Senate passed it about a month after our press release, and the Senate leader there had gotten a copy of our bill from our website, and he just thought it was a good idea, and he passed it.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Then the second state we worked on was California, where is where I live and where Barry Fadden, the president of National Popular Vote, lives. We went up to Sacramento and visited 112 of the 120 legislators over a course of several months. And we got it passed in both houses, although the governor at the time vetoed it. But we did get it passed in California in the legislature during our first year.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible progress for a brand new, pretty radical idea. I mean, it's radical not just in what it's trying to accomplish, but how it's trying to accomplish it. Has anyone done this interstate contract idea before?
Well, there are a lot of interstate compacts, and they all are very much like ours, that the states agree to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do unless they knew a certain number of other states were doing the same thing. So, for example, the Colorado River Compact, each of the states in the river basin, none of them would want to give up access to the water unless they knew all 7 states were cooperating and agreeing to reasonable limits. So there are quite a few interstate compacts, Some involve all 50 states.
Huh.
Some just involve 2 states, like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
Oh, that's super interesting. No, I'd never heard of that sort of idea before. And so I'd be curious, when you were forming the initial idea, like, did you have experience with some of this before, or did you just sort of stumble into it? Like, how do you even learn this? How did you come up with this idea, I guess?
Well, when I was in business, I was in the lottery business in the 70s and 80s, introduced the rub-off instant lottery to the state lottery industry. It turned out there was a group of 3 small states, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and they wanted to run a lotto game, which, as you know, has a big prize.
Mm-hmm.
But because the states had such small population, they couldn't get the multi-million-dollar prize that made the game attractive in any one state. So they formed an interstate compact of 3 states for the Tri-State Lotto Commission, it was called. And by getting together, they were able to offer an attractive prize, and it had a successful game. And our company got the first contract for the lotto game there. So that's how I became familiar with interstate compacts.
Wow. That's wild. Okay, so it starts off rub-off lottery tickets, and it goes to basically the most significant overhaul of voting rights in America. So that's an incredible evolution of that idea. How did you, out of curiosity, go from academia to lotteries? What was that transition like?
Well, actually, it was the opposite direction. When I got my PhD in 1972, I had been working for a company that did commercial games, supermarket and gas station games. And we sort of came up with the idea that a more secure version of those same games might be attractive to state lotteries, which were just getting started at the time. So I went into the lottery business in 1973 and stayed there for almost 20 years. And then I started teaching as a consulting professor at Stanford.
Okay, so PhD in 1972, then 20 years of basically inventing the lottery system. Then went into, what were you teaching at Stanford?
Genetic algorithms and genetic programming. It's artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that feels like a natural transition from lottery. Yeah.
Yes, right.
And then, of course, the obvious leap from genetic algorithms to, national popular vote. So this all adds up perfect.
Right. And as it happens, the president of National Popular Vote, with whom I work, he was our attorney in the late 70s to get lotteries passed by initiative in states like Arizona, California, and Oregon. And our company also did a lot of lobbying. So the reason we got into National Popular Vote was we thought we had a unique background of dealing with state lotteries and the initiative process, and that would be a very good background.
That's super interesting. So because lotteries are a state-regulated thing, you already had a lot of experience talking to state legislators and lobbying these groups, and this happens to be the same group that also picks the national president. And so that's a very unusual, I don't think, I wouldn't have expected sort of that background to have such an overlapping sort of complementary experience, skill set. But now in retrospect, it's quite clear.
Yes, it was the experience in the lottery, and we were trying to get additional states to pass state lottery. So we had done not only legislative lobbying to legislators, but also we ran 3 initiative campaigns where we put the question on the ballot and then the voters approved it.
That's pretty interesting. So there's obviously a big conversation around the role of politics and business. And sounds like in your background, politics was your business. Like you had to do this in order to function.
Well, right. Our business involved dealing with state governments. And if we wanted more lotteries to be created, somebody would have to go out and make the case to the state officials to start a lottery.
So I think obviously there are, a ton of lottery or sort of lobbying efforts from big tech firms and so forth today, but they seem to be sort of under the hood a bit. They're not as loud and proud. It sounds like for you, is such a key part of your actual business strategy was engaging with governments. But it feels like anymore, the idea of direct engagement is very frowned upon. I'd be curious for your thoughts on, like, do you think over time we're going to see more engagement between large tech corporations and either state or federal governments, or do you think that's something that should actually have a bigger separation?
Well, for most businesses, they have no particular reason, unless they're doing business with the state government, or if they're concerned about wanting some favorable legislation or opposing some unfavorable legislation. Normally, lobbying is a fairly small part of most businesses, maybe no part for a great many.
Yeah. That makes sense. So coming back to the present a bit, so okay, that's super fascinating how the organization got started, and I'd be curious also what sort of lessons. It sounds like you've developed kind of a playbook for how to work with, getting initiatives on the ballot, how to get these initiatives passed, and so forth. What's your secret? Like, if you're going to break down the, like, to give an example, there's, I think it's a general belief that the way you accomplish change is to show up and protest. Do you think that, but like you're making very significant changes to the world, but you're not doing it through like a protest movement? And so I'd be curious, what do you think works, that the technique that works the best that's being overlooked by others?
Well, you have to have something the public wants. In the case of state lotteries, there was very substantial support in the 70% neighborhood. And in each state, there was opposition, in some cases from religious groups, in some cases from people like horse race industry, who incorrectly thought that a state lottery would compete with the horse race industry, which it doesn't, but they thought that. So you have opponents, and if you have enough support, you overwhelm the opponents. In the case of national popular vote, it's pretty popular, and that doesn't guarantee anything will pass, but it is obviously the foundation of getting anything passed.
That makes sense. So step one of any kind of real world change involves make sure that people want the change you want. Shocking. What a crazy idea.
Well, indeed. And if public opinion's on your side, you have a very good chance over time of getting it passed.
So do you, when it comes to public opinion, have you commissioned just like general polls and so forth? What have you found is a good way to demonstrate that the public is on your side?
Well, we've done a lot of polls, but in the case of our issue, lots of other people do polls as well. It shows up often on Gallup polls, and any number of other organizations are asking the public about how the president should be elected from time to time. So we've done about 35 polls ourselves. We've probably seen maybe a total of 100.
Interesting.
From all kinds of different organizations, sometimes different civic groups run polls as well.
Do you engage with these other groups, like with Gallup and these others, or are they all independent?
No, we've never had any connection with Gallup. We've gotten polls, the polls we have commissioned and paid for and initiated have been with smaller companies, smaller polling companies.
That makes sense. Okay, so step one is make sure that your issue has a wide appeal in the public. And so step two is you talked about just setting up meetings with, the entire legislature. Like, how's that work? Can you just call them up and say, like, I'd like a meeting? And they'll say, okay, how's that work?
Yes, in many cases, we just directly contact them. And the issue is certainly nowadays of sufficient prominence and interest that it's reasonably easy to get meetings. But we always hire a lobbyist in any state that we're at least vigorously working on. In fact, usually a Republican lobbyist and a Democratic lobbyist, and because they're located in the state capital, they're able to get meetings and obviously advise us on strategy and politics that are peculiar to each state.
It sounds like in the early days, you would directly just walk up and make these meetings. But now it sounds like you have a sort of a lobbyist wing in front of you. It's a kind of a vanguard to clear the path so you can talk with.
Right. When we passed the bill in California, we did not have a lobbyist. Yeah. We just knocked on doors, and we had a sponsor, Tom Umberg, who was come back to the legislature after a number of years. He's there now. His office was very helpful in setting up meetings for us. But in most states, we have a lobbyist. In 3 or 4 states, we've done the lobbying ourselves.
That makes sense. Okay, so step 1 is make sure the public's on your side and use polls as one technique to demonstrate that. If others aren't doing it, just do it yourself. And then step 2 is just show up and talk to the people making the decision and either make the introduction yourself or hire a lobbyist, or I assume you probably get a lot of introductions from one supporter to another and so forth. That makes sense.
Oh, exactly. And there are national conferences of state legislators and regional conferences, which of course we go to frequently. And that's a good way to meet a large number of lobbyists informally. And then at those conferences, you set up subsequent meetings back in their home states.
So how does this legislator conference work? Is it just like a fishing conference where basically there's booths and show up and you get swag and all that sort of stuff? Well,
the bigger conferences of state legislators, and there's several different conferences every year, they have exhibits. Yes, they do have swag, and they have elaborate programs, speeches, workshops on specialized topics. We almost always get a booth if they have booths, so that we can meet the legislators as they're walking around the exhibit hall.
That's interesting. So would you say that the conference strategy for you has been like a really important part, or is that just pretty ancillary?
No, the conferences are important, and it also makes us visible even to somebody that we don't actually talk to one-on-one. They see our booth as they walk by and say, my, that's interesting, and they tuck it away in the back of their head.
All right, so step 1, make sure the people on your side. Step 2 is just get in front of the right people. So when you sit down to talk with a legislator about this, like, how's that conversation go? Do they typically start off, very opposed or curious, or just be curious what your experience has been? I'm sure it's all over the board, but if you're going to generalize.
Well, it is all over the board. Some of the legislators we meet with, not so much today, but even this year, we will run into legislators who actually haven't heard of it. But the vast majority of the 7,400 state legislators have heard of it. And usually they have questions. The first thing is we have to make sure they understand exactly how our legislation works, because it has to be explained in many cases. But then they have questions, and then they have concerns about it. And it is a big step. And the Constitution gave the state legislators this unique and exclusive power to decide how the president's elected. The method of electing the president is only vaguely outlined in the Constitution, but the actual mechanism for electing the president is state law. It's not federal law. It's not in the Constitution.
Yeah, that's and so that means there's like 50 different ways at any point in time to elect the president, like one for each state. And then how similar are they? Are they all over the board, or are they basically pretty consistent?
Well, in the early years, right after the Constitution was passed, there was an enormous variety of different methods used. But what started to happen was that starting in 1800, Jefferson in Virginia had just lost the previous presidential election by 2 electoral votes. And he lost those 2 votes, one from his own state and one from neighboring North Carolina, because the state had awarded electoral votes by district and there was a district in each state that he didn't get a majority in. And as a result, he lost those 2 electoral votes and lost the presidency. So when the 1800 election came up, he got the Virginia legislature to install the winner-take-all rule, where whoever got the most votes in Virginia would get all of Virginia's electoral votes. And that's what started this chain. It's a chain reaction, because once a couple of states started doing winner-take-all, all the other states looked at it and said, well, we're reducing our influence if we don't follow that. So over about a 30-year period, one by one, the states adopted winner-take-all.
Interesting. More or less of a domino effect over that 30-year period.
Yeah, it's a prisoner's dilemma. The classic case of or race to the bottom, where something may not be the ideal way to do it, but if other entities are doing it and you're competing with them, you pretty much have to do it.
Your hand is forced to follow suit, totally.
Your hand is forced. And by the way, that's what the Interstate Compact unravels, because we don't ask the state to abandon winner-take-all on its own, which a state would really not want to do. We only ask them to pass a law that says when we get the critical mass of 270 electoral votes, then these laws take effect simultaneously, and you get the results you wanted, which was a nationwide election of the president.
A GoFundMe of the evolution of political will. I love that idea. I kind of want to pivot here and take your temperature, get your opinion about the current happenings, the current events, given the unprecedented news cycle that's been going on over the last few weeks. What's your opinion on the current events, on what's happening, and how do you feel it's going to shake out?
Well, we were just talking about this. In the last 6 elections, we've had 2 elections where the second place candidate ended up winning the White House. In 2000, when George W. Bush won Florida by 537 votes, he got all of Florida's electoral votes under the winner-take-all, and thereby won the presidency, even though Al Gore was ahead by, as it happens, 537,000 votes, coincidentally 1,000 times more. So every vote in Florida was worth 1,000 times a vote anywhere else in the country.
Wow.
And the same sort of thing happened in 2016, where Trump found the way to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, got by very small margins, 11,000 in Michigan and 20 and 40,000 in the other states. And with these 70-some thousand votes, he was able to win all of the electoral votes of those 3 states and win the White House, even though it was 3 million votes behind Clinton. So we've had 2 second-place winners, but we've also had 2 near misses. In 2004, we had a case where if John Kerry had switched 60,000 votes in Ohio, he would have won Ohio, won the Electoral College, even though in 2004, George W. Bush was ahead by 3 million votes. And then, of course, this year, and a lot of people haven't focused on this yet, everybody's saying, well, Biden won by about 6 million votes, more or less. That's true nationwide. In fact, a switch of 22,000 votes would have elected Trump this year. So we had another near miss election. It just hasn't gotten very much attention. So Trump just carried, Biden just carried Georgia by about 12,000 votes. He carried Arizona by something like 12,000, and he carried Nevada by a similar small margin, and he carried Pennsylvania by, I guess, 60 or 70,000. But the point is, if as few as 22,000 people had changed their mind, Trump would have won this election in the Electoral College, even though he would have been 6 million votes behind in the national popular vote.
Wow. And that's just a glaring disparity, just keeping that as the trend goes, as each election happens, it seems that this is just only getting highlighted more and more, which I think is, again, just more evidence on the need for an organization like National Popular Vote, like what you guys are trying to achieve.
The fact is the ballgame has changed. Now nobody seems to care whether the president gets elected with the most votes. In fact, it's almost a virtue that he not be.
Yeah, well, I think I'd agree with you there. I mean, crazy times. Maybe just getting back to kind of like maybe thinking the next steps for national popular vote. So it was Colorado the first time it was officially on the ballot anywhere, and it won pretty much by a landslide, didn't it?
Yes, it was the first time it was on the ballot. In fact, our bill passed the legislature and was signed by the governor in 2019, amidst a whole bunch of other controversial bills. There was a sex education bill and an oil and gas bill and a red flag gun control bill. And our bill passed first and became the lightning rod for everything that people were unhappy about the legislature doing. So a petition was circulated that put national popular vote on the ballot in Colorado, and it came up a couple of weeks ago in November 2020. And fortunately, the voters approved the bill, but the voters in Colorado and a number of states have the power to review a bill that's been passed by the legislature and decide whether they like it. And also, a great number of states have the initiative process, which allows voters to sign a petition and put a question on the ballot and adopt the legislation, much like we did with the lotteries. So a potential way of passing national popular vote in some states is to get an initiative petition and put it on the ballot and try to get the voters to approve it.
Well, that's interesting. So it sounds like to date, you haven't really relied upon initiatives like citizen initiatives for the national popular vote. Why haven't you done it so far?
Well, initiatives are extraordinarily expensive. We just had one here in California where $200 million was spent on one proposition.
Whoa. And
even in smaller states like Nevada, there was a $100 million petition in 2018. So the initiative process is expensive. It's somewhat expensive to get it on the ballot, to actually go through the process of collecting signatures, but it's extraordinarily expensive to run an initiative campaign.
Got it. So you think there are some hard costs to actually get onto the ballot, which is primarily the cost of gathering the signatures. But then you're saying to actually win is just a classic sort of just massive.
Oh, the campaign is the big cost.
Mm-hmm.
The petition can be a big cost depending on the state. Some of the states are quite difficult to get signatures. Others are easier.
I see. So going to like the costs of political change. And so when we had talked a couple of years ago, the National Popular Vote, I think, organization had an annual budget around $6 million. Is that right? How has that changed? Was that right then? And how has it changed since?
No, our budget has never been anywhere near that big.
Oh,
what was almost $6 million was the Colorado referendum campaign.
Uh-huh.
Normally, our budget is in the $2 to $3 million area.
Wow. And I'd be curious just to hear, like, what is the organization today? What kind of, you mentioned a bunch of lobbyists, I think 2 per each state that you're active in. What's the actual staff of the organization?
Well, we have 9 people that work not quite full-time each. And then we have usually 2 lobbyists in a great many states simultaneously. Sometimes we have a dozen states where we have lobbyists. Sometimes we have 8. Depends on the year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredible. I mean, coming from Silicon Valley, there's this perception that you can't do anything without $1 billion. Like that's basically this, the table stakes are just such astonishing large numbers. And I think it's interesting how you are able to leverage what, by comparison is like a very small amount of resources to achieve really incredible world changing and truly world changing. Yes, it's about the US elections, but the US elections affect the entire world. And so I think that you're operating on such a huge scale. And I think it's inspirational to hear that that's possible, because I think that we're told by the VCs and by everyone else that like, nope, you can't do anything on that scale. $2 million is nothing. And then it's like, nope, actually $2 million is the difference between the success or failure of democracy. And it's hard to exaggerate the value of that. So I think it's great. I would be curious, as you're sort of looking forward, what are the sort of changes in strategy as you adapt to this COVID world? Because you mentioned that actually a lot of your historical past has been like sitting down face to face with legislators, going to conferences and so forth. Like, are those conferences even happening anymore?
Well, this year the conferences were canceled, and we've obviously done almost no traveling, but we've held just about as many meetings with state legislators as in previous years, almost 1,000 this year, largely by Zoom or Skype or occasionally by phone. So after March, the amount of travel that our people have done has been very, very small.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah. And so have you found like a difference in effectiveness now that we've all been forced into this telecommuting experiment together? Do you want to go back? Do you want to go back to the in-persons, or do you actually think the Zoom and Skypes are more effective?
Well, I think like a lot of people, there's no question a face-to-face meeting is more natural and more congenial than any kind of electronic meeting. But we've been impressed with how much eye contact and body language and how close these video meetings are to the real thing. Obviously, they're not as good, and you can't establish a really personal rapport over a video connection. But for the purpose of having a conversation and explaining something and noticing when the eyebrow goes up when you haven't explained things correctly and have to go back and re-explain it, we've been quite pleased and surprised that the video meetings have worked out as well as they have. In any case, there wasn't much choice. Not only would it have been foolish for our people to be traveling extensively this year, many of the state legislators have preferred to have video meetings because they don't want to meet with dozens and dozens of different people in the course of the day.
So if, the playbook for making world change is like step one, make sure that the people are behind you, using polls and intuition and so forth. Step two, just do the work to get in front of the right people. Step three, have those meetings ideally in person, but, Zoom's a good fallback. And I'd say maybe step four, I'd be curious, it sounds like you guys are taking a huge burden on the shoulders of very few people. How can the population at large help? I mean, there's protests, there's initiatives, and there's things like this that engage millions of people, but that actually hasn't really been your strategy so far. So I'd be curious, what have you done effectively to work with kind of the population at large, and what can people do overall to help?
Well, the most important thing anybody can do is to talk to their own state legislator, either by email, and we have a system on our website at nationalpopularvote.com that's very convenient for writing your state legislators and other state officials all at once, telephoning your state legislators, visiting them, whether in person or Zoom, doing things like writing letters to the editor, of course, speaking up at civic meetings, and then, of course, donations. All of these things take money, and donations help. But the single most important thing for people to know is that they should talk to their state legislators and tell them that they favor a national popular vote bill. And state legislators, much more so than congressmen who have so much bigger districts, they interact with their constituents very, very freely and extensively. It's harder for a congressman or obviously a U.S. senator to do that, but state legislative districts tend to be small.
Do you think that like one thing that's been very interesting is here, I live in Portland, Oregon, and it's been sort of the center of the BLM protests in response to sort of George Floyd's murder. And there's been a huge protest movement. And the protest movement has been interesting because the protesters themselves have not been advocating for specific policy change, but it seems like those policy changes have happened. Now we're seeing like the real police accountability bill passed. And even now we're talking about some significant changes in the state legislature or the state level to kind of override the police union collective bargaining and so forth. And so I'd say, what's your take on the effectiveness of protest for this kind of nationwide change?
Well, protests can be very helpful if they're peaceful and have a reasonable goal that the public can latch onto and agree with. But as we well know, they can also drift into disorder and violence, in which case it's almost always counterproductive then. But certainly protests are part of the democratic process, an appropriate part, provided they're done peacefully.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then there you have it then. The playbook for changing the world. Step 1, make sure the people behind you. Step 2, get in front of the people who make those decisions. Step 3, ideally do it in person. If not, call, email your state legislator, whatever it is, whatever it takes. And then step 4 is, if all else fails, turn to the public, do initiatives, and protest, but peacefully. So that's good. That's a good summary of how to make it work.
And there it is, easy as that.
Well, that's right, David. I think you're right.
Looking forward to 2024, you guys are almost there to the 270 electoral college votes you'll need to enact your playbook. What are the next steps for national popular vote? Tomorrow, the next day, the coming years, looking to 2024, what are your next steps?
Well, every year, including this year, we're visiting state legislators every month of the year. By the way, most state legislators meet only for a few months at the beginning of a year. There are a few year-round legislatures, but most of them are packed into the front end of the year. So we talk to legislators all year round. Obviously, we focus our attention on the states where we've passed one house of the legislature or gotten some toehold. For example, in Missouri and Georgia, we passed the elections committee by unanimous votes. Well, that's therefore a good starting point to make progress next year. In 9 states, we've passed one house of the legislature, which you have to start over every 2 years. But if you've passed one house once, you have a pretty good chance of building on that so that you can pass the second house. And then there's all the other states where we haven't passed either house or committee, but we have to work on those too. But the highest priority are states where we've passed one house or where we have a bill that has a lot of sponsors. For example, in Michigan, in 2018, our bill had 25 of the 38 senators as sponsors. So that's a good start.
Hey, well, this was great. Thank you so much. Again, been a huge fan. Oh, one thing we didn't talk about, but maybe for another time, or just even off the record, like, what's your take on gerrymandering? Obviously, national popular vote is a big deal. Gerrymandering is also a huge deal.
Oh, it is a huge deal. And as you well know, there's numerous groups, the Common Cause, League of Women Voters, a number of others that have been working on that. That is a really hard problem and a very important problem.
Yeah, I mean, is there any angle? It seems like the interstate compact is a really clever solution to the national popular vote. Is there a similar clever solution to gerrymandering?
As a matter of fact, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who happens to have been the sponsor of our bill in Maryland, which is the first state that passed national popular vote, he actually has a proposal out where states would get together and agree to set up nonpartisan redistricting commissions in pairs so that one party would say, he's from Maryland, the Democrats in Maryland, instead of perhaps gerrymandering Maryland, would get together with the Republicans from a adjacent state or a nearby state and agree that both of them would do nonpartisan redistricting so as to remove the obvious political advantage that each political party has in the state that they control. So, yes, the idea of an interstate compact, it's a little complicated, but it could be, and there is a proposal out there that Raskin has.
Great. Well, it looks like there might be a national popular vote V2 on the way, tackling the next layer down.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
There we go. And there you have it. Real change is possible. You can affect the world around you. We just gave you the playbook. Everyone listening out there, call your legislators, call your local representatives, and let's get this on the road to 270 for 2024. John, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, well, David, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me.
Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World is brought to you by Expensify. Hosted by David Barrett and Monty Bernard. Engineered and produced by Monty Bernard. Theme song by DJ Mick. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you happen to be listening. Head to Expensify.com to sign up for a free trial and see just how easy it is to automate your entire pre-accounting process. Expensify. Easy money. Expensify.